this is about people. And that's the most important thing I think about the Americans with Disabilities Act, that anytime you're looking at it, it's about people. It's about fairness. It's about providing opportunity, equal opportunity. And all the things that takes. It takes environmental modifications. It takes attitudinal adjustments. And it takes changes in policies and procedures and the way we do things. Most of all, it takes what we've kind of been talking about in this entire conference. It takes a recognition of us all as human beings. And if we're going to be a community, if we're going to be a society, then we're as strong as our every link that we have. When a chain starts to break down, it's a link that breaks. And if we're not serving and making value of all of our links, then we're not doing what we can do as humans. And so I'm always excited to talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act from that standpoint. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, it is first and foremost a civil rights law. There are no ADA police. There's nobody out there. Who enforces the Americans with Disabilities Act? We do, exactly. It's a civil rights law. It's the same as anything else. It's the same as if you face discrimination based on, I guess looking around this room, I can safely say based on your gender. Because as much as people might talk about, poor me, I have all of the advantages. I get paid more for the same jobs unfairly and so on and so forth. So there's, if there's a gender basis for discrimination, it's that same kind of process. It's a civil rights complaint. So this is a civil rights law. It's a civil rights law that passed far quicker than any other civil rights law in our history. Far quicker. It was enacted in July 26, 1990. There's a picture of then President George H. Bush, a very strong supporter of the Americans with Disabilities Act, signing with Justin Dart, one of the champions of disability rights, beside him, and some other disability advocates. Like many statutes, it has titles. You always have titles. You have parts, chapters, if you will. So Title I's employment got lots of attention and still gets lots of attention, and has had zero impact on employing more people with disabilities or getting more employment for people with disabilities. So that's an ongoing challenge. Title II is what was called the sleeping giant of the ADA. And the reason it was called that is because nobody paid any attention to it. It kind of snuck through. Everybody was all excited about Title III, public accommodations and commercial facilities. What was going to happen to small business? What was going to happen to big business? And how could we possibly do this? And oh my gosh, the cost of business. And nobody thought about state and local governments. And yet, they ended up being huge. And we'll talk a whole bunch about that. Title IV, this is really an interesting one, because at the time of the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, what did telecommunications typically involve? Telephone. You know, those things that used to sit on a cradle and had a cord and push buttons. Some of them still had the rotary. Remember the phones where you could switch from pulse dial to tone dial? Yeah. So you could press it and go So, yeah, what a different time. Now what is telecommunications all about? Email, internet, websites. Telecommunications has become a huge issue. At this time, when it first passed, we had telephones. We talked about TDDs, telecommunication devices for the deaf, or TTYs, the teletypewriters. Those are phased out. Those are starting to be like so yesterday. And then Title V, we always have a Title V or a Title something or other that says miscellaneous, and it has everything. It reinforces some issues. In this case, it reinforces strongly that there shall be no retaliation or coercion. So the numbers of people covered, I was talking about Title V, just to finish up. So it does extend coverage to Congress. It does reinforce that thou shalt not retaliate against somebody for trying to realize their rights under the law, and that you should not coerce or force somebody not to file a complaint. Those things are additional charges on top of charges of discrimination. So when the ADA was passed, we estimated there were about 43 million people with a disability. That in the 2000 census changed that number to 54 million Americans. That's gone up. A lot of numbers now say 58 million. I'm going to say it really doesn't matter. It's a whole lot of folks. There are 300,000 people with disabilities in Idaho, a 1995 study. But again, I think you can raise that up. Some of these things are a little old. I mentioned about association, and here it is. Cannot discriminate against an individual or entities because of their relationship with a person with a disability. We talked about the number of people with disabilities. So the first thing you have to know about the Americans with Disabilities Act is, who the heck are we talking about? And I mentioned the ADA Amendments Act of 2008. And that's where this becomes really important. So I'm going to go through the definition as it is, because the definition hasn't changed. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how the interpretations have changed because of the 2008 amendments. So definition of disability. It's really pretty broad. And it's not the same as Social Security or workers' comp. So you're going to run into different definitions, and those are pretty technical, and they're kind of medically oriented and so on. The ADA is not intended and was not intended to be that way. It's intended to cover a pretty broad spectrum of folks. There are 3 prongs. This is where it gets kind of funky because I forget what kind of transitions there were. So now I know there's a transition, so I have to do this again. So first of all, it's a person with physical or mental impairment that limits one or more major life activities. Well, that seems pretty straightforward. Has to be an impairment, and it's kind of physical or mental. So we know that much. Or it could be a person with a record of such an impairment. So they don't have it right now. They may have had it. Cancer. Could have been significantly impaired, going through treatments. Anyway, so we have a person with a record of a physical or mental impairment. So we're talking still, they've had a condition. And as mentioned, so the hepatitis treatments, the chemo, or somebody going through chemo, you actually have that impairment at the time. Afterwards, things are fine. And then finally, this is kind of an interesting one, the person that's regarded as a person with a disability. So somebody that, somebody said, well, they, seem kind of slow. And, well, what does that mean? Seem kind of slow. Maybe they have a disability, right? And so they're treated like they do, but they really don't. And the example the ADA used a lot was somebody with severe scarring from a burn or something. So they look like something's wrong, and yet they have no impairment whatsoever, but they're treated as though they do. So that's kind of an interesting one. It really extends it to a lot of folks. So what's a physical impairment? I mean, there's all these things. This is where we start to get into the depths of it. But when you're talking with somebody, this is what you're kind of looking at. And somebody asks you, what does it mean? Well, it's a physiological disorder or condition. Now, everybody would always ask, well, what about somebody who's severely overweight? Well, why? And so when you start looking under this prong of the definition, right, because there's 3 prongs. So it may not matter because maybe they're going to be treated as or regarded as having a disability. So folks get really hung up, and attorneys love to, and courts ended up deciding on issues related to these kinds of questions. So physiological disorder, condition, cosmetic disfigurement, or anatomical loss affecting one or more of the following body systems. Don't you love this stuff? So, and this, in the 2008 amendments, changed a little bit. They added on some clarification. But anyway, so lots of stuff. Cardiovascular, reproductive, somebody with HIV, and so on, would all be covered under that. Because they did decide early on that it didn't have to be a major life activity didn't have to be just of walking or seeing or hearing. It could be like having the ability to have children. That's kind of a major life activity. Any mental or psychological disorder, such as mental retardation, organic brain syndrome, emotional or mental illness, and specified learning disabilities. And this list is non-exhaustive. So, the first prong, having a disability that substantially limits a major life activity. Well, we have to look at substantially limits. What does that mean? Well, it means in comparison to the average, they're restricted to the conditions, the way they do something. So major life activities, performing manual tasks, walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, breathing. Breathing is an important one. Learning, working. And again, it's not an exhaustive list, I don't think. But how long are things going to last? The nature and the severity of the physical impairment or mental impairment. So if you have somebody that had a skiing accident, they broke their leg, they're going to be in a cast for 6 weeks, and everybody's signing their cast, and they say, well, I want an accommodation. Are they going to be a person with a disability? How many people think yes? Anybody yes? A couple people think yes. What happens to the average person when they break their leg? How long are they in a cast? About 6 weeks. So it's kind of the same as everybody else, right? So thinking about that, how different is it? So this person broke their leg and they have complications, they end up with some staph infection, and so they end up back in the hospital and they're going to go on therapy and having to do physical therapy and some other treatments over the course of the year. Would they be a person with a disability under the ADA? Likely they would be. Because in comparison to the average person, they have some substantial limitations. So how long is it going to last, expected to last, permanent, long-term impact? You run into this with, you'll talk to people that are dealing with work-related injuries. And remember, workers' comp is totally different from the ADA, nothing to do with the Americans with Disabilities Act. But you run into it because somebody's off on workers' compensation. Well, do they have coverage when they're returning to work under the ADA? And that's a real kind of open question mark. And what I always respond to people is maybe, doesn't hurt to pursue it. Let's talk about it and take a look again at some of these definitions. And this is why it's kind of important to have this little bit of nerd level investigation into it, because you're going to talk to people and lead them kind of through that process of analysis. Well, what do you think in comparison to the average person? Is it really different? Is it more severe? How long is it going to last? And so on and so forth. So sometimes there can be a combination of impairments that, when taken together, create a substantial limitation. So that's another thing to look at for folks. There's an interesting one, substantially limited in major life activity. We ADA nerds, we used to kind of love this one because you kind of dive into that. And so what does substantially limited in the major life activity of working mean? Well, is that Social Security thing? Is that, well, not necessarily. What it talks about is if you have a job that's very specific, major league pitcher, you gotta be able to pitch. And if you end up with arm problems, it might not appear to be a substantial limitation to the average person. For the purpose of you doing your job, or anything related to your job, it's a major issue. So anyway, kind of an interesting little thing. I won't go into that in great depth. Now here's something that was fascinating. Because what the ADA said initially is you would judge all of these issues, these conditions, without respect, without bringing in any mitigating measures. I.e., what's the hearing loss like without hearing aids? What's the ambulatory ability of somebody when they don't have their prostheses on? What's a person's health like when they're having some issues controlling their diabetes? Now, other times they're on medication, right? They're doing fine. Everything's fine. I really don't even have to deal with diet restrictions. My meds are working great. And so, are they a person with a disability then? Well, the ADA said initially that, well, yes, they are. You judge without the mitigating measure taken into account. And that created some problems, big problems. Because then all of a sudden the lawsuits started coming in. So Sutton versus United Airlines, a couple of regional airline pilots with myopia sued United Airlines for not hiring them due to their uncorrected vision. And so the lawsuit went in. This was a terrible suit on behalf of people with disabilities, because the courts came back fairly quickly on this one and said, well, wait a minute, with the glasses they can see just fine. And so we don't see them as people with disabilities. The courts upheld that. So that starts to set precedent. And so all of a sudden this mitigating, without regard to mitigating measures, was under fire. The court ruled that the ADA requires a present substantial limitation. If corrected, no substantial limitation of a major life activity exists. So, substantial limitation is assessed with regard to mitigating measures was the result. So that's really bad. So all of a sudden, how many people are out there facing discrimination, yet they're all of a sudden not covered by the very law that was designed to cover them? So, enter the ADA Amendments Act. What had happened, as there had been a narrowing, the courts narrowed the definition of disability. So we got this act going in 2008 and clarified it. So the ADA Amendments Act of 2008 restored the original intent of the ADA by reinstating the broad scope of protection, moving the focus from the threshold issue of disability to the primary issue of discrimination. It started to say that it doesn't matter whether the disability fits the definition just yet, because what if discrimination occurred because of a disability? So let's take a look at the discrimination. So that was really cool. And reaffirming that although the definition of disability is intended to be broad, only those individuals who are qualified and can prove discrimination are entitled to relief. So there has to be some evidence of discrimination. That's what we're trying to stop. We're not quite as concerned about who has a disability. That's kind of cool. Clarifies the definition of disability by rejecting those holdings in several Supreme Court decisions and portions of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission's regulations. Clarify the congressional intent to protect the civil rights of individuals with a disability. Yes. So the language in the definition actually changed. So it's, here it is again, has a record, has the impairment, has a record of the impairment, is regarded as. The terms within the definition were clarified. It was enacted on September 25th, 2008, became effective on January 1st, 2009, and the final regulations were published in the Federal Register on March 25th, 2011. And the EEOC regulations became, see, there's all these dates. This is like being back in school, right? So the meaning of the terms kind of changed. So substantially limited, that said prevent or severely restricted, was too demanding. That was what the original language said. And the major life activities were too narrow. They needed to be expanded to include bodily functions. So the law said, the general rule in the ADA is it's against the law to discriminate against a qualified individual on the basis of disability, who can perform the essential functions of a job with or without reasonable accommodation. That's kind of in Title I, that's a general rule. So when an impairment prevents an individual from performing a major life activity, or significantly restricts the condition, manner, or duration, that's the original law, what it said, right? So the ADA Amendments Act told courts to look at that differently. Construe the term broadly and without regard for the ameliorative effects of mitigating measures. So anyway, I won't go into that a whole lot more, because I think the basic message is that it changed, and this is no longer true. Now the second prong, a record of having a disability, could be a history of mental illness, and heart disease, cancer I mentioned, An incorrect classification, somebody, again, treating somebody as though they have a condition. And they're regarded as actually kind of interesting too, because it consistently lost in courts. One of my experiences with it, the person actually won, and I'm not sure that it actually was a case of discrimination, but the courts have not been quite so kind. People have been discriminated against due to an employer simply guessing they may have a disability based on stereotypes. They've tended to be a little tougher to prove once they get into the court. Now, I used to see those in the Human Rights Commission, and we did find on those. We decided that, you know, if somebody knew somebody had a vocational rehabilitation counselor and then they took an adverse action, then we would see that as they knew they had a disability, or at least they were regarding them. In that case, they knew they had a disability because you had to get the voc rehab services. But somebody else that they would treat because they thought they had issues, they couldn't learn something, so they were, again, stereotyping them. There are some exclusions in the definition of disability, and these are kind of important. A person who currently illegally uses drugs is not protected by the ADA when the covered entity acts on the basis of such use alone. Now, if somebody has another disability and they also are illegally using drugs, if they face an adverse action because of that disability, then the drug use doesn't disqualify them. But if they are acted against because of their illegal use of drugs, now this doesn't necessarily mean use of illegal drugs. It's illegal use of drugs. So it could be somebody else's prescription. You're taking the wrong prescription. You're overdosing. You've got OxyContin. You're taking more of it. You've taken somebody else's OxyContin. That's illegal use of drugs. And so you're not covered as a person with a disability, even though somebody who has gone through a treatment program and is no longer addicted to drugs is covered as a person with a disability. Does that make sense? The bottom line is illegal drug use disqualifies you from being a disability, having a disability. If you, on that basis, if you've gone through a treatment program and are not currently illegally using drugs, you do have protection under the ADA. So what about alcoholism? What about the use of alcohol? Same thing, right? Wrong! Alcoholism is always covered as a disability under the ADA, whether you're drinking or not. And it's a difficult thing, difficult enough that one of the presentations by one of the other ADA centers across the country, and there's 10, the person giving the presentation incorrectly said alcoholism was the same as illegal drug use, which always makes it kind of awkward because you kind of have to talk to them afterwards and they're supposed to know what they're doing there. Anyway. There's some other exclusions, homosexuality, bisexuality, anything that Congress felt would be perhaps a little overly controversial, compulsive gambling, kleptomania, or pyromania, even though they may stem from a mental illness and so on and so forth. Those are specific exclusions. So that's it for definition of disability. Does everybody know what a disability is? Yeah, thank God for the ADA Amendments Act, because this is what happened. People started digging down into that, is it a disability? Not, well, it's not a disability, they're not covered. Okay, forget it. And so it allowed discrimination because people got hung up. Now, the presumption is that, and certainly with respect to employment, that a person has a disability. If there's some evidence that they likely have a disability, then we're going to assume they do, and let's take a look at what happened. And that's going to determine really whether we decide it's a disability and illegal